Good morning, everyone. My name is Keren Indira Manan, and together with Michelle Gloria Dewantoro and Lidya Wati Evelina, we are from the Marketing Communication Program at Bina Nusantara University, Jakarta. Today, we are pleased to present our research entitled Exploring Parasocial Relationships, e-WOM, and Brand Advocacy in Celebrity-Owned Beauty Brands. Let us begin with the background. Digital platforms are reshaping communication between brands, public figures, and consumers, particularly in the beauty industry. This has contributed to the emergence of celebrity-owned beauty brands, which leverage personal branding and digital communities to build relationships and engage with consumers. One prominent example is Rhode, founded by Hailey Bieber in 2022. Rode achieved 212 million US dollars in FY 2025 revenue and was later acquired by ELF Beauty in a deal valued at 1 billion US dollars. This makes Rode a relevant context for examining consumers' communication within a celebrity-owned beauty brand's community. Next is research gap and objective. Previous studies have examined parasocial relationships in relation to purchase intention, consumer attitudes, and e-WOM. Research has also explored e-WOM as part of consumer communication and behavior in digital environments, as well as voluntary consumer support and brand advocacy in online brand communities. However, how these communication practices are manifested in naturally occurring online conversations within celebrity-owned beauty brands community remains poorly understood. Therefore, the study examines consumer communication within Rhodes digital communities by exploring how parasocial relationships, e-WOM, and brand advocacy are reflected in online conversations across social media platforms. The study proposes three main analytical perspectives. First, parasocial relationships provide a perspective for understanding emotional communication between consumers and the celebrity figure. Second, e-WOM provides a perspective for examining participatory communication through online consumer interactions. Third, brand advocacy provides a perspective for understanding voluntary consumer support within digital communities. Together, this perspective contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of consumer communication in celebrity-owned beauty brands community. The theoretical framework consists of three main concepts. First, parasocial interaction theory explains one-sided emotional connections with public figures, examined through emotional attachment, trust, perceived intimacy, and identification. Second, e-WOM refers to online consumer communication, including reviews, recommendations, testimonials, and information sharing. Third, brand advocacy refers to voluntary consumer support through brand events, brand positivity, brand information sharing, and virtual positive expression. Celebrity personal branding provides the contextual foundation, particularly through Hailey Bieber's digital presence and perceived closeness. The study applied a qualitative social listening approach using Brand24, an AI-powered social media monitoring platform. Data were collected from TikTok, Instagram, X, YouTube, online news portals, blogs, and discussion forums. The observation period covered June 28 to July 28, 2026, and the search focused on English language conversations to support accurate interpretation of context, sarcasm, and nuanced consumer expressions during manual coding. Keywords related to Rhode and Hailey Bieber were used, while exclusion keywords were applied to reduce irrelevant mention. Approximately 19,000 mentions were retrieved. Using intensity sampling and Brand24's most popular feature, the first 1,710 mentions were manually reviewed, and 94 conversations met the inclusion criteria for deductive thematic coding. During manual review, obvious spam, duplicate mentions, and obvious bot-generated content were also removed. The 94 selected conversations were evaluated using a predefined qualitative coding framework. Parasocial relationships were examined through emotional attachment, trust, perceived intimacy, and identification. e-WOM included reviews, recommendations, testimonials, and information sharing. Brand advocacy includes brand events, brand positivity, virtual positive expression, and brand information sharing. The data were Analyze using a deductive thematic approach. First, we examine the brand 24 outputs to understand Road's overall digital communication environment. We then repeatedly read the selected conversations to understand their context and meaning. Second, we manually coded the selected conversations using the predefined framework. Each conversation was assigned to one main theme based on its dominant communication pattern, with relevant indicators identified within the theme. Third, the coded expressions were compared with the original conversations to ensure accuracy and contextual consistency. Finally, the identified patterns were interpreted in relation to the three theoretical concepts. Importantly, the coding framework was established from the outset based on the theoretical concept rather than emerging from the data itself. Moving to the results, the Brand24 monitoring identified approximately 19,000 mentions, with an estimated reach of 261 million users and more than 23 million social media interactions. In terms of sentiment, 7,655 mentions were positive, 10,373 were neutral, and 972 were negative. TikTok was the dominant platform, accounting for 62.1% of total mentions, followed by online news at 16% and X at 12.5%. Overall, this indicates high visibility and active audience participation with predominantly positive public conversations. The first finding concerns parasocial relationships. Several conversations reflected emotional attachment, perceived intimacy, trust, and identification with Hailey Bieber rather than the product themselves. For example, the statement "so proud of Hailey" reflected emotional attachment toward Hailey and her achievements. The statement "doing my makeup like Hailey Bieber" demonstrated identification to the intention to imitate her appearance and beauty routine. Finally, consumers expressed both perceived intimacy and trust toward Hailey, referring to her as "our girl" and recognizing her as a creative force behind Rode. Overall, these findings suggested that consumers developed emotional connections with Hailey Bieber that extended beyond product consumption. Next is e-WOM. E-WOM was widely observed across consumer conversations within Rode's digital community. It was reflected through consumer-generated reviews, testimonials, recommendations, and product-related information sharing based on personal experiences with Rode products. Positive e-WOM was more frequently observed, with consumers sharing favorable product experiences and recommendations. For example, one consumer described the bronze glazing milk as a game changer, while another explicitly recommended the blush to others. However, negative e-WOM was also present, including dissatisfaction and reports of skin irritation. Overall, consumers actively shared both favorable and unfavorable product evaluations and recommendations. The third finding concerns brand advocacy. Consumers actively participated in supporting, promoting, and amplifying Rode through digital interactions. The identified forms of brand advocacy included brand positivity, virtual positive expressions, and brand information sharing. For brand positivity, consumers expressed confidence, satisfaction, and continued support toward Rode. For virtual positive expressions, consumers publicly expressed strong enthusiasm and identified themselves as dedicated Rode fans. Another consumer shared information about Rode's Vancouver pop-up while expressing strong support as a fan of the brand. Although brand defense was included in the theoretical framework, no conversations reflecting this indicator were identified in the analyzed dataset. However, the other forms of advocacy were still evident. When the findings are considered together, the three perspectives provide complementary ways to interpret consumer communication. Parasocial relationships show the emotional dimension of communication with the celebrity figure. e-WOM shows consumers as active participants in creating and circulating brand-related information. Brand advocacy shows voluntary consumer support emerging through everyday digital interactions. Overall, the three perspectives work together to explain how consumers participate in emotional, participatory, and supportive communication within celebrity-owned beauty brand communities. This study contributes to communication studies in two main ways. First, theoretically, it positions parasocial relationships, e-WOM, and brand advocacy as complementary perspectives for understanding consumer communication in celebrity-owned beauty communities. Second, methodologically, it demonstrates the applicability of qualitative social listening and deductive thematic analysis for examining authentic consumer communication across digital platforms. In this way, naturally occurring online conversations can provide empirical insight into consumer communication patterns. This study also has several limitations that should be stated clearly. First, coding subjectivity. No formal intercoded reliability assessment was carried out, so there is some room for subjective interpretation in the coding. Second, the observation period. 1 month on conversation may not capture longer-term communication dynamics. Third, the single brand context. The study focused on one celebrity-owned beauty brand, Rhode, which limits the transferability of the findings to other brands, industries, or digital community contexts. Considering these limitations, several directions can be considered for future research. On rigor, a formal intercoder reliability assessment would strengthen confidence in the coding. On time, extending the observation period would capture longer-term communication dynamics. On context, comparing multiple brands and digital communities would test how far these patterns travel. For recommendations, the study proposed three main directions. First, authentic engagement. Brands should encourage transparent and meaningful interactions between the brand, celebrity, and consumers. Second, consumer participation. Brands can facilitate user-generated content, reviews, testimonials, and experience sharing. Third, methodological integration. Future studies can combine social listening with interviews or surveys to gain a more comprehensive understanding of consumer communication. To conclude, the findings show that consumers engage with Rhode beyond product consumption by expressing personal connections, sharing experiences, and communicating their views through digital conversations. The study also highlights qualitative social listening as a lens for capturing naturally occurring conversations and providing insight into consumer communication across digital platforms. Overall, the findings provide a more comprehensive understanding of consumer communication within celebrity-owned beauty brand communities. That concludes our presentation. Thank you for your attention.